I'm Bob Blaskiewicz. I'm from Stockton University in New Jersey, and I'm going to be talking about a guy by the name of Arthur J. Cramp, who is, in my opinion, an unacknowledged hero in the fight against quackery. I'd like to start by thanking Mike Jarsulik. He's my collaborator on an article about Cramp that appeared in Skeptical Inquirer recently, and his work informs this presentation heavily. After the Civil War, American medicine was mostly unregulated. It was kind of a wild west of competing treatment philosophies and modalities. There were few standards of care for any disease, and there was no national standard for accrediting medical practitioners. Certainly no common science-based standard for prescribing medical treatments existed. Additionally, the market for bottled remedies was almost wholly unregulated. There were no mechanisms to assure the purity, safety, or efficacy of most medicines. Really, the only standard for patent medicines was buyer beware. So for all its imperfections, the American medical system right now is, in theory, based on the premise that treatments are efficacious and evidence-based, at best. There's a lot of room for individual practitioners to, we give them lots of leeway, but we have our physicians are trained in accredited schools, they're licensed, they must uphold medical boards' standard of care. And Arthur J. Cramp, I think, is an important part. He plays an important role at the point where we're going from one set of affairs to the other, going from the Wild West days to a more regulated and centralized version of American medicine. So Cramp was born in London on September 10th, 1872. His father, Joseph, was a blacksmith, and at the age of 16, according to London census records, Arthur was apprenticed to an engineer. He came to the United States at the age of 19, and he moved to Missouri, where, according to a biographical blurb at the American Medical Association files, he did farm work and, quote, attended an academy in that state and then taught at a country school, at the same time writing a weekly column in the local newspaper. He married a woman from Missouri named Lillian Torrey. They moved to Waukesha, Wisconsin, where they both taught at the Wisconsin Industrial School for Boys, a reformatory high school. I know that one of their students once stole a train, and that's how we ended up there. It was a school of about 300 boys. It seems to have been a pretty good match for this young scholar slash apprentice slash farmhand. Students spent about 4 hours a day in class and spent the rest of the time working on the 250 acres of farmland or in industrial training shops, and he had experience with all of those venues. Cramp maintained this ethos, the ethos of an educator, throughout his life. On November 7th, 1898, while the Cramp family was in residence at the school, Lillian gave birth to their daughter, Torrey. Unfortunately, Torrey died on January 2nd, 1900, according to her death record, of seizures related to meningitis. A colleague later recalled that Torrey's death was a motivating factor in Cramp's approach to quackery and why he went after it so hard. I should say that I haven't been able to find the name of the doctor. We were able to, and the problem with the diagnosis is that there was no way to treat communicable meningitis at the turn of the last century. So the outcome would have been largely the same. The treatment would have been wait and keep her comfortable, basically. In 1906, Cramp graduated from the Wisconsin College of Physicians and Surgeons, and in December of that year, he was hired as a medical editor at the American Medical Association in Chicago, and this is where he would work for the next 30 years. Cramp happened to join the AMA at an especially opportune time to combat quackery. He would become a major contributor to the AMA's delegitimization of non-scientific modalities that threaten physicians' interest. And the AMA originally really was just a physician's interest group. Part of their mission was to exclude non-traditional practitioners, botanicals, homeopaths, that sort of thing, and have a sort of internal standards that they weren't really able to achieve until about 1900, I don't think. So according to Eric Boyle's Quack Medicine, History of Combating Health Fraud in 20th Century America, the AMA, since its founding in 1848, had a policy of forbidding any member to, quote, dispense a secret nostrum, whether it be the composition of exclusive property of himself or others, for if such nostrums be of real efficiency, any concealment regarding it is inconsistent with beneficence and professional liberality, and if mystery alone gives it value and importance, such craft implies either disgraceful or fraudulent avarice. If you find a way to cure something, you need to share it because it's the only ethical thing to do, right? Further, they say, it's also reprehensible for physicians to give certificates attesting the efficacy of patent or secret medicines or in any way promote the use of them. In line with this assertion about the promotion of bunkum, since 1850, the AMA had a rule on the books forbidding journals that advertised patent medicines from joining the AMA's new Association of Medical Journal Editors, which was established expressly to improve publication standards in American medicine. Nonetheless, patent medicine advertising was so ubiquitous and so fundamental to publishing in American medicine that even JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, didn't enforce this minimum standard until the 20th century. In 1905, the year before Dr. Cramp joined the organization, the AMA had established the Council on Pharmacy and Chemistry, which is an in-house laboratory to analyze the contents of patent medicines to determine which were eligible to advertise in JAMA. This established the AMA as one of the very few groups in the nation that had the capacity to scientifically evaluate patent medicines, which, according to Boyle, accounted for about 50% of all prescriptions in large U.S. cities at the time. When Cramp joined the AMA, he joined the AMA at the beginning of a major initiative to crack down on quackery, and this led to the establishment of the Propaganda for Reform Department, which Cramp directed and which worked in concert with the Council on Pharmacy and Chemistry to publicize its findings and to serve as a clearinghouse of information about bogus medical treatments, medical fads, and dubious health practitioners. The nation as a whole at this time, at the turn of the 20th century, was kind of primed for a round of reforms and quackbusting. The rapid urbanization that transformed American society and the context of the practice of medicine in the second half of the 19th century brought with it a host of new social problems. The modernizing reformers of the progressive era, who sought to tackle these modern problems, were compelled to action partly by the work of muckraking investigative journalists who exposed corruption, abuse, waste, and inequity in the system. The most important muckrakers for our purposes here are Samuel Hopkins Adams and Upton Sinclair. In 1905, the year before Cramp joined the AMA, Samuel Hopkins Adams published a series of articles in Collier's that would eventually be collected under the title The Great American Fraud. The Great American Fraud was a landmark, prodigious, damning expose of predatory medical quackery. Adams named names, he kept receipts. He exposed charlatans. He visited the institutes and laboratories that were actually in people's kitchens where they were making these things, right? He revealed the alcohol content and the narcotic content of the most popular patent medicines. And you can see that some of these, there was a way to get around prohibition when it came about. You wouldn't have something a wee bit more medicinal, would you? You know, like that kind of, so Peruna and Hostetter's stomach bitters. He also revealed this profitable codependence between advertisers and publishers, which was enshrined in this feature called the Red Clause. The Red Clause was the invention of Mr. F.J. Cheney, the maker of Hall's Catarrh Cure and the president of the Proprietary Association of America. As Adams put it, quote, Cheney explained that he had printed in red letters on every advertising contract a clause providing that the contract should become void in the event of hostile legislation. When a state legislature threatened to take action against a dodgy drug manufacturers, Cheney would blast out a reminder of this clause to the local newspapers, and soon you would see editorials declaiming and denouncing the legislation. Adams also revealed an industry of selling personal information. When prospective customers respond to ads that they see, they pass along two bits of information: the letter writer's address and the condition from which they suffer. These letters and envelopes became commodities that were purchased by letter brokers who would rent bundles of letters to the next quack who, for instance, wanted to directly market to someone who had already expressed an interest in kidney remedies, or perhaps more socially sensitive conditions like syphilis, drug dependence, alcoholism. Other quacks would rent these letters bundled according to disease and target likely customers. We now call this Facebook. It really is. I have an article that's coming, and it's from a book about the history of customer research. Yeah, it's interesting. As dodgy medical practices were receiving increased scrutiny and criticism, so was the manufacture of food. The second half of the 19th century, a number of new preservatives, fillers, additives, food substitutes, and dyes were introduced into the American food chain. Few of them were ever tested for safety before they were introduced. Deborah Bloom, in a recent book, The Poison Squad, discusses the variety of tricks and shortcuts and frauds that food producers employed. So, for instance, dairymen would skim the cream off the top of milk, right? Then they would add water to stretch out the supply a little bit. Then they would add chalk or plaster of Paris to whiten it up a little bit. And then they would take pureed calf's brains calves' brains, but they would have used cat if they had it, like calves' brains, and that was the substitute for the cream. Yeah, yuck. New embalming fluids like formaldehyde were added to meat to keep it from rotting, or to rejuvenate expired and rotting meat. As Bloom makes clear that at the national level, the food industry had the support and protection of politicians who dragged their feet on pushing through any new pure food reforms. Even an adulterated food scandal that erupted during the 1898 Spanish-American War, involving the Rough Riders and Teddy Roosevelt in Cuba, they were issued canned meat rations that were rotting and putrescent on arrival, to the point that people couldn't even be around the food. It was so bad. I think they said the only way it was palatable was in a stew, but come on. So whatever would give the federal government the impetus to push through pure food legislation, it would have to be something more shocking than the armor company poisoning U.S. troops. That something was the jungle. In 1906, novelist and socialist activist Upton Sinclair published some of the most nauseating pages of The Machine Age. The jungle was set in Chicago in the meatpacking plants that he'd investigated. A typical example compares the relative horrors inflicted on the bodies of workers. There were the men in the pickle rooms, for instance. Scarce a one of these had not some spot of horror on his person. Let a man so much as scrape his finger pushing a truck in the pickle rooms, and he might have a sore that would put him out of the world. All the joints in his fingers might be eaten by the acid one by one. There were men who worked in the cooking rooms in the midst of steam and sickening odors by artificial light. In these rooms, the germs of tuberculosis might live for 2 years, but the supply was renewed every hour. There were the wool pluckers, whose hands went to pieces even sooner than the hands of the picklemen. For the pelts of the sheep had to be painted with acid to loosen the wool, and then the pluckers had to pull out the wool with their bare hands till the acid had eaten their fingers off. Worst of any, however, that's not even the worst. The worst of any, however, were the fertilizer men and those who served in the cooking rooms. These people cannot be shown to the visitor, for the odor of a fertilizer man would scare any ordinary visitor at 100 yards. And as for the other men who worked in tank rooms full of steam, and some of which there were open vats near the level of the floor, their peculiar trouble was that they fell into the vats, and when they were fished out, there was never enough of them to be worth exhibiting. Sometimes they would be overlooked for days till all but the bones of them had gone out to the world as Durham's pure leaf lard. So the abuse not only of the plant's immigrant workers, but also the public trust had an immense impact on the perception of a need for increased regulation of consumables, and that included medicine. And they went through with the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. As far as the regulation of patent medicines was involved, this law intended to regulate manufacturers' claims about drugs, but the Supreme Court interpreted that law very narrowly to mean that only what was claimed on the label needed to be accurate. Advertisements, yeah. Because obviously. Nonetheless, if the presence of potentially dangerous drugs, certain potentially dangerous drugs, such as opioids or alcohol, had to be disclosed for the first time. You did not have to reveal all the ingredients in your proprietary medicine, but if you listed it, it actually had to be in there. Claims of effectiveness were unregulated. The 1912 Shirley Amendment was intended to close this loophole, but it did something else. During the legislative sausage making, never mind. The phrase false or misleading was replaced with false and fraudulent. So it's harder to establish, for a regulator to establish that a manufacturer has intended to defraud someone, it's fraudulent, than it is to demonstrate that someone was misled. So it really did water down the amendment. That's how it goes. In 1910, the Carnegie Foundation released what was known as the Flexner Report, a book-length study of medical education in the US and Canada. And this report led to reforms that established the scientific method as the gold standard for medical education. And that directed resources away from other practitioners and modalities, homeopathy, botanicals, eclectic medical colleges. Accreditation of schools and medical licensing then as now was handled by state boards of medicine. And there has never been a federal agency to bring all the various state standards into line. At this time, the AMA as a national organization was one of the few institutions which could potentially arbitrate the standards of medical practice. Of course, the AMA existed to promote the interests of physicians first. And Cramp thought that a government agency should do this, but, quote, the exigencies of politics make it well nigh impossible for health agencies to tell unpleasant truths when these involve huge vested interests. Nevertheless, if the public's health is to be served, these truths must be told. So as the director of the Propaganda for Reform Department of the AMA, which would later be called the Bureau of Investigation, I'll refer to it as both the department and bureau, Dr. Cramp identified and exposed quackery, subjected remedies to scientific analysis, assisted government, public, and professional policing efforts directed at controlling health fraud, and he spearheaded a 30-year public education program in the belief that, quote, the best the medical profession can do in protecting the public is to turn the light on the methods of the fattest and the quack, so that his ignorance or fraud becomes apparent. The centerpiece of the propaganda department was this growing collection of materials related to quackery. The collection grew out of information from Cramp's prodigious correspondence with professionals, members of the public, and practitioners. People would query the AMA for information about the variety of treatments and practices, or doctors who are drifting through the area or whatever. What do you know about this guy? And the growth and comprehensiveness of the collection depended in large part on the structure of the AMA as a national professional organization, where most physicians work for themselves out of their own offices and who receive the AMA's journal. In essence, the AMA was a central node connected to all physicians and state medical associations in the country. And this network of physicians around the country was a very sensitive instrument for the detection of bullshit. When patients asked about a new treatment or a preparation they'd seen advertised, their physician could send a note to the AMA, and Cramp's office would send them whatever information they had. Or if they hadn't had anything yet about this particular person, they'd ask for more information. Could you do a little research for us and send us what you have? And they'd start a subject file for them. So between 1918 and 1930, the number of letters answered by Cramp's office ballooned from under 2,000 inquiries per year to over 12,000 a year, and that's according to Boyle. A fairly typical example of how this collection grew bit by bit can be seen in the file for a treatment called sprayozone. In 1925, Cramp received a query letter from Francis E. Franjak, Buffalo's public health commissioner. Franjak asked for any information that the AMA had on sprayozone, a nasal spray, a nighttime nasal spray, which claimed to, quote, protect your children from infantile paralysis, polio. Yeah, and he included a sample of the nostrum in its packaging. On October 9th, 1925, Cramp replied to the query. Your letter of September 23rd was received in due course, as was also the specimen of sprayozone. As we had no record of sprayozone and received no queries, whatever about it, we're not justified in going into any large amount of work in investigating the nostrum. We did, however, ask the MA Chemical Laboratory to make a preliminary examination of the product, and he quotes the lab report in which chemists suggest that sprayozone was essentially borax and potassium chlorate. It's dissolved in water. A synopsis of the cursory qualitative examination of sprayozone appeared in the February 12, 1927 edition of JAMA. All of these items in the packaging material are preserved in the sprayozone folder at the AMA in Chicago. Through thousands and thousands of inquiries and similar exchanges with physicians, regulars, and members of the public and students were encouraged to write to the AMA to ask questions. Cramp steadily amassed basically this vast arsenal of information to unleash against medical hucksters and their enablers. Within 5 years of arriving at the AMA, according to James Harvey Young, who you should read as the historian of American quackery, quote, Cramp's office contained over 12,000 cards in a fake file listing products, firms, and names of promoters. His testimonial file held the names of over 13,000 American and 3,000 foreign doctors who'd given testimonials for proprietary drugs. By 1937, this card catalog had expanded to some 300,000 entries. Eventually, the collection would grow to 3,500 files spread over some 10,000 folders, totaling 370 cubic feet of material, or as the archivist who described and cataloged the entire collection put it in the 1990s, 185 standard file drawers. It's huge. It's a kid in Toyland there. I love it. So yeah, Cramp made extensive use of this collection during his time at the AMA. He wrote a weekly column in JAMA where he put extraordinary medical claims to scrutiny. He contributed the occasional article to both H.L. Mencken's American Mercury magazine and to the AMA's popular health magazine, Hygeia, to which he was also an advisor. Not only did he investigate the products and quacks, he also looked into the histories of the people involved, gathered information about their business plan, fact-checked their advertisements, discussed the reasons that quacks were so convincing, and generally pulled back the curtain on a type of medicine that was grounded in marketing rather than evidence. Cramp wrote with a sharp wit and a keen sense of the absurd, and he kept a copy of Lewis Carroll's works at his desk to get in the proper mindset to write about the absurdities he was chronicling. So in an article about quack treatments that had received U.S. patents, for instance, Cramp singled out a concoction patented in 1913 by the late Elwha Vicara, which claimed, quote, the present invention relates to a compound which is intended to be used internally and which confers to the organism's immunity against the following microbial infectious illness: diphtheria, pneumonia, typhus, scarlet fever, influenza, septic infections, cerebral spinal meningitis, syphilis, pest, is that plague, I guess, cholera, and tuberculosis. It is also a factor in another kind of disease, goiter. Cramp wryly noted, by the time the patent was granted, the inventor was dead, and his estate got it, since by the use of his own preparation, he should have been immune to practically all diseases. He probably died of senility. So, yeah. Among Cramp's other duties, he answered thousands of letters written to the MA by laymen, better business bureaus, and advertising managers of publications who had standards about their advertisers. The propaganda department.
You want to talk about pushback, bro? I mean, you talk about everything he does, but wasn't there a lot of pushback against?
There was pushback against the AMA at large. There were a number of lawsuits. There were a number of prominent quacks who part of their shtick is to never back down, is to go harder when you attack them or question their credibility. And the AMA had wranglings with them. There was pushback, and you could argue, and Boyle argues this pretty convincingly, that ultimately his educational efforts failed because homeopathy is still a thing. You know, you can educate people, but you can't break that emotional tie that people have to these treatments and to the practitioners. In the politics of the day, you know, Deborah Bloom in her book, she talks a lot about how determined to not make reforms the federal government was. And one of the things, I'm going to be talking about this type of stuff in my class with freshmen next semester and the freshman seminar, and I want to show them how we got what we have today. Like, this is where this comes from. This is why over-the-counter stuff is available and you don't need a prescription for it. And all these sorts of things, like to show the kids that this current medical system comes from somewhere. Let's see if we can, you know, trace find out where things went wrong. I don't know. Young remarked, the historian of American medical quackery, remarked that scarcely an investigation was launched by a regulatory agency, but that an inquiry went to Cramp to see what information the AMA already had on hand. Starting in 1912, the Bureau also published educational materials, including posters and slideshows, lantern slides that would be sent to people so that they could give, you know, these presentations, and off-prints of Cramp's JAMA articles about different forms of medical quackery. Much of that material, in turn, was gathered into Cramp's 3 volumes, work called Nostrums in Quackery, which were published between 1911 and 1936 and are basically a comprehensive guide to pseudomedicine during this period. Cramp knew that he was fighting an uphill educational battle as long as patent medicine manufacturers could advertise directly to potential consumers. His critiques of nostrum advertisements tended to focus on a couple of themes. The first is the use of selling copy, which sought to plant a need for a product in the minds of a target audience. So you would see, here you have the selling copy from about 1919 of Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound, you know, or you're nervous and weak and, you know, trying to play up how sick you feel, kind of a imposed hypochondria, you know. And then you have this older style of advertisement where a general store manager would just have a list of the things that came in, and Cramp was nostalgic for this earlier type. This is what we have, but here they're just focusing on one product and making you want to have that one product. No man, Cramp argued, has any moral right to so advertise as to make well patients think that they are sick and sick persons to think they are very sick. Such advertising is an offense against the public health. He roundly condemned, quote, such periodicals and newspapers as are not above sharing the blood money of quack remedies. He saw these periodicals as enabling especially cruel fraudsters, or as he described them, quote, the swindler who sells stock in bogus companies to presumably intelligent human beings is a gentleman compared with these scoundrels who lie to the sick, humbug the suffering, and fraudulently take the money of the incapacitated. While other forms of merchandise that did not perform their function or purpose would quickly be found out, fake medicine conspires with nature to trick patients into believing that fake treatments work. According to Cramp, he said, the healing power of nature is such, fortunate for biologic perpetuity, that the general tendency of the disordered animal economy is to get well. And probably about 80% of all human ailments, the afflicted person gets well, whether he does something for his indisposition or does nothing for it. Herein lies the opportunity of the quack and the nostrum vendor, essentially sell sequence as effect, right? It's the post hoc fallacy. Cramp also despised the use of testimonials in advertising, knowing how misleading they could be. A case in point is a 1913 investigation into a supposed tuberculosis cure called Pulmonol. The testimonial givers are, as always, divided into 2 classes. Those who really had tuberculosis and those who did not have it. As we've said many times, it's useless to investigate fresh testimonials. Most of them are written in good faith, And not until the cases have progressed further are the victims undeceived as to the efficacy of the nostrum. It's therefore necessary to wait a year or two before looking into testimonials of this class. Then we find invariably that the consumptive who had relied on the nostrum is dead. Cramp then goes through and lists 9 patients who had provided testimony on behalf of Pulmonol, which had appeared either in newspapers or in advertising pamphlets. Cramp had statements from patients' physicians and some from the patients themselves, and as so often was the case, he found that the patients, if they had ever existed, which wasn't a foregone conclusion, had either never been sick, or they had diagnosed themselves, or were still sick, or had died of the ailment that they thought they'd beaten. So when possible, Cramp would juxtapose a patient's testimonial with their obituary, as was possible when Sargon, a preparation that was 18% alcohol, placed an ad in the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle featuring J.R. Kimber's testimony on June 25th, 1930, 5 days after the same paper had announced his death. Yeah. Another important aspect of Cramp's educational project was to give public lectures to schools and professional groups, civic organizations across the country. He did this for free. He only asked that you have a lantern slide projector, a standard lantern slide projector for him. And he did this all over the country. He was giving dozens of talks across the country every year in the early 1930s. These had topics like patent medicine and the public health, pink pills and panacea, fighting deafness, quackery, and objectionable medical advertising. My favorite aspect of his public engagement was his propaganda for reform column in JAMA. This column kept tabs on quacks' legal troubles across the country, published the results of the AMA's chemistry lab's analysis of various patent medicines, and published occasional reports of Cramp's own investigations into extraordinary claims. For instance, between March and November 1910, Cramp investigated a fellow in Grand Rapids, Michigan, named A.W. Van Bijsterveld, who has a magnificent mustachio. He claimed he could, quote, locate the cause of your aches and pains for free via the mail, if only you would send him a vial of your urine. Van Bijsterveld was a self-proclaimed, quote, expert inspector of urine, and claimed that he had used a, quote, secret process handed down generation after generation and most carefully guarded by the old families of Europe. Van Bijsterveld assured prospective clients that though his secret methods are not taught in schools, quote, he examines an average of 25,000 bottles of urine a year. This alone stamps him as an authority of exceptional qualifications. Wow, I know, it's like no amount of bad evidence is worth a good piece of evidence, right? A sample was prepared by the chemists at the AMA by Cramp. It had water, pepsin, aniline dye, and ammonia in it. And they sent it to the Van Bijsterveld Medicine Company. The diagnosis came back. Careful examination of the urine shows there's too much acid in the blood, which will cause a rheumatic condition. The back is weak, and you will have a tired, nervous feeling most of the time. I'm like, now I will. Meanwhile, correspondents working with Cramp in Iowa and Michigan contacted the company in the same way and sent identical samples to the first file from the AMA. This time, the mixture in one case indicated poor blood, a malfunctioning liver, gas, nervousness, and heart problems. In the other, it indicated weakened kidneys, a catarrhal condition that's inflammation of mucosal membranes of the stomach and bowels, and nervousness. Nervousness is always in there. I bet his treatment may take care of your nervousness. Lastly, 2 more samples were sent in from different addresses in Chicago. This time, both vials were filled with 95% tap water and 5% glucose. This would indicate that the patient wasn't diabetic, but they were peeing something with twice the sugar content of Red Bull. And the diagnosis came back either as liver disease or a catarrhal digestive tract. Cramp's conclusion was fairly unequivocal. The whole thing shows conclusively the examination of the urine is a farce, the diagnosis is a fake, and taking money from victims for the treatment of purely imagined disease is a fraud and a swindle. And this type of thing could get someone in trouble. One of the few people who could crack down on frauds was the postal inspector. So if he's doing this through the mail, that was an avenue for prosecution. So, yeah. Cramp conducted a similar experiment in 1927, which was published in Hygeia under the title The Bald Facts. Professor Maurice Scholder was the proprietor of the Professor Scholder Institute, a clinic for the balding in New York City. He promised he could evaluate scalp health from samples of hair sent by patients through the mail. Cramp put this claim to the test too. He first mailed them a sample of fox hairs from a fur coat. Scholder's diagnosis came via letter and read, "The roots are in a seriously undernourished condition. You're in grave danger of continuous and increasing loss of hair, but it can still be saved by prompt treatment." And for $20, he promised a treatment, which he claimed to have learned from a Dominican friar in Spain, that will, quote, it's always from Europe, right? Will positively restore your hair and scalp to normal, healthy condition, stop further falling out of your hair, and if you follow my instructions faithfully, notice it's the patient's fault if it doesn't work, enable you to grow strong new hair to replace that which you have already lost. Cramp then arranged for Confederates at different addresses again to in turn send Scholder strands from a sample hair from a dog, hair from a young woman who had a full head of hair, and strands from a 2-inch length of twine. Cramp received verbatim the same diagnosis for all three samples. And as he concluded, quote, the Scholder advertisement stated that the newspapers of the country had proclaimed Scholder as, quote, the marvel of his profession. They were conservative. Any man who, on the basis of microscopic examination of pieces of dyed twine, could diagnose the hair health of persons he'd never seen and then positively restore the hair and scalp to normal might readily be called a marvel. Yeah. So in June 1934, Cramp was in Cleveland attending the AMA's annual conference when he suffered a debilitating heart attack, and he never really recovered from it. He was bedridden for several weeks following the episode, and when he returned to work, he found that he tired very easily and that he wasn't able to keep his former pace. As a result, he canceled numerous presentations and took a drastically reduced workload. As he suggested to one correspondent, if it is not too much later, may I suggest that you transfer the proposed talk to some Friday in March 1935, if that's not too late. By that time, it seems to me I should either be able to give the talk or should have been quietly interred under the auspices of some respectable undertaker. Right? By September of 1935, he, working under these frustrating limitations, he decided to retire just shy of 30 years at the AMA. In his retirement, he moved to Fort Lauderdale and then to North Carolina. He continued to correspond with the AMA and his editor, Morris Fishbein, and he completed and published the third and final volume of Nostrums and Quackery. Cramp died at the age of 79 in Hendersonville, North Carolina, on November 25th, 1951. According to his obituary in JAMA, it was of arteriosclerosis and uremia. The editors remembered him as, quote, a prolific and constant contributor to the journal and a pioneer in the fight against quackery and fraud in the healing arts. The legacy he left behind was well expressed in an early review of his, I think it was the third volume of Nostrums and Quackery in the British Medical Journal. All volumes have been compiled by Dr. Cramp, who for 30 years led the struggle against heartless fraud. This is a fine record of courageous persistence in public service. The persistence is all the more remarkable because the struggle is endless. Whenever a fraud is exposed, a half a dozen new ones spring up to take their place. But Dr. Cramp has never been disheartened by the unending nature of the task to which he devoted his life, and which is ongoing. The AMA closed the Bureau of Investigation in 1975. about the same time that medical regulations started loosening up for alternative medicines. The files that Cramp and his successors had gathered over the decades became known as the American Medical Association Health Fraud and Alternative Medicine Collection.